Steel clashed against steel with a metallic clang that echoed through the narrow valley of the Sierra de Gredos Mountains. Rodrigo, a 23-year-old Spanish soldier, felt the French bayonet approaching dangerously close to his left side. His musket, with its traditional bayonet nearly half a meter long, felt clumsy and unbalanced in the hand-to-hand combat unfolding in that mountain pass. It was March 14, 1809, and the Spanish guerrilla forces under the command of Juan Martín Díaz, known as El Empecinado, had laid a perfect ambush on a French supply column crossing the region. The problem was obvious to any Spanish soldier who had faced French veterans in hand-to-hand combat. Spanish muskets, designed primarily for ranged fire, became cumbersome weapons when fitted with the standard bayonet. The resulting excessive length shifted the center of gravity forward, making each charge an enormous effort and leaving the soldier vulnerable during the recovery phase. The French, with their more modern rifles and better balanced bayonets, consistently dominated these personal engagements. 3 weeks earlier, the situation for the Spanish resistance in that mountainous region was desperate. Napoleon's troops controlled the main supply routes, and the Spanish irregular forces were forced to operate from the mountains, attacking when they could and retreating before enemy reinforcements arrived. General Francisco Javier Castaños had sent a secret message to all the guerrilla groups in the area. They had to change their tactics or they would be systematically destroyed by the French imperial forces that were patrolling the region with increasing efficiency. Rodrigo was part of an irregular unit of 60 men under the charismatic leadership of El Empecinado. He had been a blacksmith in his hometown of Avilac before the French invasion turned him into a soldier. His experience working with metal had given him an intuitive understanding of balance, weight, and the strength of materials. For weeks, he had watched his comrades fight at a disadvantage against the French in hand-to-hand combat, losing valuable men not for lack of courage, but because of the technical limitations of their weapons. The ambush that day had begun perfectly. The Spanish allowed the French vanguard to pass and attack the center of the column where the supply wagons were traveling. The first shots from the rocks caused confusion and casualties among the French. But now, after the initial volley, the fighting had transformed into a brutal hand-to-hand battle on the narrow mountain path. And it was here that the French tactical superiority became evident. Manuel, the soldier fighting alongside Rodrigo, attempted a thrust against a French grenadier. The long bayonet of his musket extended clumsily, and the Frenchman, more agile with his better balanced weapon, easily dodged it before counterattacking. Manuel had to retreat several paces to regain his balance, and only the intervention of Antonio, who fired his pistol at point-blank range, saved the young soldier from certain death. Rodrigo blocked another French attack, but felt his arms tremble with exertion. The musket, with its loaded bayonet, weighed over 5 kilograms, and holding it in a defensive position during prolonged combat quickly drained his strength. He saw 3 more comrades fall, all victims of the same disadvantage. Their weapons were excellent for firing at a distance, but they became lethal impediments when the enemy came within range of the steel. The order to retreat arrived just in time. El Empecinado, from his elevated position, had spotted French reinforcements approaching along the road from the east. The Spanish guerrillas dispersed into the mountains with the discipline born of experience, taking with them what they could loot from the supply wagons. They had inflicted damage on the enemy, yes, but they had lost 14 men in the process. 14 lives that the Spanish resistance could not afford to lose. That night, at the makeshift camp set up deep in a mountain cave, the men took stock of their losses. Diego, the group's most senior sergeant, stated the obvious. They had won the initial skirmish, but had lost the hand-to-hand combat. Rodrigo listened silently, mechanically cleaning his musket, his blacksmith's mind analyzing the situation from every possible angle. There had to be a solution. There had to be a way to even the playing field in close combat without sacrificing the musket's long-range firepower. While his comrades slept, Rodrigo stayed awake by the dying fire, his eyes fixed on his bayonet. The answer was out there, somewhere, waiting to be discovered, and that answer would shift the balance of power in the clashes between Spanish guerrillas and French soldiers across the region.
What none of them knew yet was that the modification Rodrigo was about to devise would become a tactical innovation adopted by Spanish irregular units on multiple battlefronts. The first light of dawn found Rodrigo still awake with 3 different bayonets laid out on a blanket in front of him. He had woken Manuel and Antonio an hour earlier, asking to borrow their bayonets for an experiment. The 2 soldiers, trusting their fellow blacksmith's intuition, agreed without asking too many questions. Rodrigo had begun meticulously measuring each component: the total length of the blade, the point of balance when attached to the musket, the distance from the barrel to the center of mass of the combined weapon. The numbers he noted on a scrap of paper salvaged from captured French supplies revealed a telling story. The standard Spanish bayonet measured 47 centimeters from base to tip. Mounted on the musket, which was already 140 centimeters long, the combined weapon reached almost 2 meters in total length.
The center of gravity shifted dramatically forward, forcing the soldier to use both arms with considerable effort just to keep the weapon horizontal. El Empecinado approached the blacksmith just as the sun began to illuminate the peaks of the surrounding mountains. The guerrilla commander was a middle-aged man, hardened by years of fighting the French. With eyes that had witnessed too many fallen comrades, he watched silently as Rodrigo practiced thrusting techniques from different angles, meticulously noting each observation. "Have you discovered anything, blacksmith?" El Empecinado finally asked. His voice was deep, but not impatient. Rodrigo stood up, one of the bayonets in his right hand. "Commander, I think I've found the problem. It's not the quality of the steel or the temper of the blade. It's pure physics. The excessive length of our bayonets shifts the soldier's center of gravity too far. Each thrust requires 3 times the effort, and the recovery is slow, leaving us vulnerable." The commander nodded slowly. He himself had experienced that clumsiness in close combat, though he had never been able to articulate the problem technically as Rodrigo did. "And what is your solution?" he asked with genuine interest. The blacksmith took a deep breath before answering. "I need to shorten the bayonets, reduce them to about 1/3 of their current length, 30 centimeters instead of 47. El Empecinado's initial response was skeptical. "Shorten our weapons? Wouldn't that put us at an even greater disadvantage?" asked Rodrigo, who had already anticipated this objection. "With all due respect, Commander, we are already at a disadvantage. The French outmatch us in hand-to-hand combat, not because their bayonets are longer, but because their weapons are better balanced. If we shorten our bayonets to the correct length, we will regain our balance. The center of gravity will be closer to the soldier's body again, thrusts will require less effort, be faster, and recovery will be instantaneous." The commander nodded slowly. He himself had experienced that clumsiness in close combat, though he had never been able to articulate the problem technically as Rodrigo did. "And what is your solution?" he asked with genuine interest. The blacksmith took a deep breath before answering. "I need to shorten the bayonets, reduce them to about 1/3 of their current length, 30 centimeters instead of 47. El Empecinado's initial response was skeptical. "Shorten our weapons? Wouldn't that put us at an even greater disadvantage?" asked Rodrigo, who had already anticipated this objection. "With all due respect, Commander, we are already at a disadvantage. The French outmatch us in hand-to-hand combat, not because their bayonets are longer, but because their weapons are better balanced. If we shorten our bayonets to the correct length, we will regain our balance. The center of gravity will be closer to the soldier's body again. Thrusts will require less effort, be faster, and recovery will be instantaneous." Diego, the veteran sergeant who had overheard the conversation, chimed in with a practical question. "What about range? In combat, every inch can mean the difference between life and death." Rodrigo had considered this as well. "We'll lose 17 centimeters of range, yes, but we'll gain speed, accuracy, and stamina. A soldier who can deliver 3 quick, controlled thrusts is more effective than one who performs a slow, clumsy thrust. Furthermore, with better balance, the angle of attack improves. I've calculated that the strike will gain approximately 30% more penetrating power due to better energy transfer." El Empecinado pondered this carefully. He was a commander who had survived by relying as much on his intuition as on his experience. There was something in Rodrigo's methodical reasoning that resonated with his own observations of combat. "And how long would it take you to modify the bayonets for the entire unit?" asked Rodrigo,
looking toward the camp where the 60 men of the guerrilla group were resting. With the right tools and 2 assistants, I could modify 10 bayonets a day, 6 days for the whole unit. The decision was not easy. El Empecinado summoned his subordinate officers to an impromptu meeting. Manuel argued in favor of giving Rodrigo the opportunity. "We've lost too many men in hand-to-hand combat. If there's any chance of improving our odds, we should try." Antonio supported this position, recalling how he had seen his younger brother fall in an ambush 3 months earlier, a victim of his own weapon's clumsiness at the critical moment. There was resistance. Some of the more conservative soldiers argued that modifying standard military equipment was almost heretical, an admission of inferiority. But El Empecinado knew the harsh reality. They were waging a war of attrition against an enemy superior in numbers and resources. Innovation wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity for survival. He made his decision with the authority granted by his experience and rank. "Rodrigo, you have 6 days. You will modify the bayonets of the entire unit. If your theory is correct, you will have saved Spanish lives. If it is incorrect, at least we will have tried something." The blacksmith nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the responsibility that had been entrusted to him. That very morning, with the help of Manuel and Antonio, he set up a makeshift forge in the main cave of the camp. The tools were primitive: an anvil salvaged from an abandoned village, hammers of various sizes, rusty but functional tongs, and a hand-operated bellows that kept the embers hot enough to work the steel. Rodrigo began with his own bayonet, carefully measuring where to make the cut. The hacksaw produced a harsh sound that echoed off the cave stone walls as it slowly bit into the tempered steel. The modification process proved more complex than Rodrigo had initially anticipated. It wasn't simply a matter of cutting the steel and calling it a day. Each bayonet required individual treatment, cutting at the precise calculated point, filing down any rough edges, retempering the tip to maintain the proper hardness, and finally polishing the surface to prevent premature rust. The blacksmith worked from dawn to well into the night, with Manuel holding the pieces while Antonio kept the embers burning at a constant temperature. By the 3rd day of intensive work, they had completed 26 modified bayonets. Rodrigo allowed the first volunteers to try out the redesigned weapons. Diego was one of them, and his expression of surprise as he made his first practice thrust spoke volumes. The musket with the shortened bayonet felt like a natural extension of his body.
The center of gravity had returned to a manageable position, just in front of the hand holding the weapon by the butt. "It's like the weapon weighs half as much," Diego remarked after a series of practice movements. "The thrust comes almost on its own, and I can instantly regain my defensive position." He demonstrated for the watching soldiers 3 quick, successive thrusts, each precise and controlled, followed by a fluid defensive movement. With the standard bayonet, such a sequence would have been impossible without immediate exhaustion. Murmurs of approval began to spread among the guerrillas. But there wasn't complete agreement. A group of veteran soldiers, led by a corporal named Esteban, voiced their lingering doubts. 30 centimeters is 30 centimeters, Esteban argued. In a real engagement, that loss of range could mean the Frenchman reaches you first. It was a legitimate concern, and Rodrigo knew only a practical test could definitively resolve it. El Empecinado, observing the growing division within his unit, proposed a solution: a simulated combat exercise. The test was scheduled for the 4th day. 20 men with modified bayonets would face 20 men with standard bayonets in a controlled combat exercise, their weapons covered with rags to prevent real injuries. The rules were simple. The first valid touch would determine the winner of each individual encounter. El Empecinado would act as referee, assisted by Diego and 2 other experienced sergeants. The exercise began in a clearing near the camp, with the rest of the unit forming a circle to observe. The first skirmishes were revealing. Manuel, using a modified bayonet, faced a larger, stronger soldier using the standard weapon. The fight lasted barely 10 seconds. Manuel's opponent attempted a long thrust, but Manuel dodged it with minimal lateral movement, using the greater speed of his shortened weapon to deliver 2 quick thrusts before the other soldier could recover his position. Victory for the modified bayonets. The next 3 engagements produced similar results.
The soldiers with shortened bayonets demonstrated remarkably superior mobility and reaction speed. They could switch from attack to defense fluidly, execute effective feints, and maintain the pace of combat for extended periods without showing any signs of fatigue. Esteban, watching from the circle of spectators, began to reconsider his initial skepticism. Before we get to the decisive hours, and believe me, what happened next changed the course of the entire war, we want to know what city or country you're watching from. Write it in the comments. If you want more detailed war stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. A like helps these important historical events reach more people. Now let's go back to that crucial moment. The 10th encounter definitively changed the skeptics' opinions. Esteban himself decided to test the waters, using a standard bayonet against Antonio, who wielded a modified one. Esteban was considered one of the unit's best hand-to-hand combatants, with years of experience and numerous real battles under his belt. He was confident that his superior skill would compensate for any technical disadvantages of his opponent. The fight began with Esteban attempting to use his extended reach to keep Antonio at bay. He made several probing thrusts, testing his opponent's defenses. Antonio, however, made no attempt to block directly. Instead, he dodged with minimal movement, allowing Esteban's long bayonet to pass close without striking. Each time Esteban extended his attack, Antonio noticed the veteran momentarily lose his balance, struggling against the displaced weight of his weapon. Then Antonio saw his opportunity. Esteban thrust forward with a firm thrust, fully extending his weapon. Antonio moved into Esteban's guard, too close for the long bayonet to be effective, and placed his own shortened bayonet against the veteran's side in a move that would have been lethal in actual combat. The silence that followed was absolute. Esteban slowly lowered his weapon, nodding respectfully at Antonio. "The blacksmith is right," Esteban declared clearly so everyone could hear him. "Speed and balance trump reach in close combat. I want a modified bayonet." His public declaration eliminated the last of the resistance. If Esteban, the most ardent skeptic and the most respected fighter, was convinced, then the modification was valid. The guerrillas began to form a line in front of Rodrigo's makeshift forge, each eager to get their improved weapon. For the next 2 days, Rodrigo, Manuel, and Antonio worked tirelessly. The forge never stopped. Sparks flew constantly, and the metallic clang of the hammer against the anvil became the camp's constant soundtrack. Each finished bayonet was meticulously tested by its creator, verifying the balance, the edge, and the structural integrity of the modified steel. The opportunity to test the modified bayonets in actual combat came sooner than expected. On the 6th day, just as Rodrigo was completing the last of the 60 bayonets, a Spanish scout arrived at the camp with urgent news. A larger French supply column than the previous one was advancing through the Teatar Valley. According to the scouts' reports, they were transporting ammunition, gunpowder, and provisions destined for the French garrison in Talavera.
The column consisted of approximately 80 regular infantry soldiers, 20 mounted dragoons, and 12 wagons loaded with vital supplies. El Empecinado immediately gathered his officers. The temptation was great. The supplies the column carried could sustain the guerrilla forces in the region for months, but the risk was also considerable. 80 French infantry soldiers were formidable adversaries, trained, disciplined, and well-armed. The guerrilla commander studied the makeshift map drawn on the ground, calculating distances, march times, and strategic positions. "We'll attack through the Arenas ravine," he finally decided, pointing to a narrow spot on the map where the path wound between 2 rocky hills. "It's the only place where we can neutralize their numerical advantage. The walls of the ravine will limit their ability to maneuver." Diego nodded, acknowledging the tactical wisdom of the decision. "And the mounted dragoons? Cavalry can be devastating in close quarters if they manage to organize themselves." El Empecinado smiled sadly. "That's why we'll attack first from above. We'll fire muskets from the heights to sow chaos.
then we'll descend for close combat. The unit mobilized with the efficiency born of experience. 60 Spanish guerrillas marched silently through the mountains, taking secondary routes known only to local shepherds and smugglers. Rodrigo marched in the center of the column, feeling the comforting weight of his musket with the modified bayonet. Manuel and Antonio walked beside him, nervous but determined. This would be their first real test of the modified weapons against professional French soldiers. They arrived at the Arenas ravine 3 hours before dawn. El Empecinado deployed his men with tactical precision, 30 sharpshooters on the northern rise, 20 on the southern rise, and 10 more concealed at the bottom of the ravine to block any escape attempt. Rodrigo was assigned to the north group along with Manuel, Antonio, and Diego. From their elevated position, they had a perfect view of the winding path that snaked through the ravine, like a compacted earth serpent. The wait was tense. The sun began to illuminate the peaks of the eastern mountains as the guerrillas remained completely motionless among the rocks, blending into the landscape. Rodrigo checked his musket for the 10th time, verifying the charge, the flint, and the gunpowder. The shortened bayonet was firmly attached. Its reduced length made it less visible and more manageable in the narrow spaces between the rocks. The sound of hooves and wheels came first, amplified by the walls of the gorge. Then they appeared. First, the mounted dragoons, scouting the path with expert eyes. Behind them, the infantry in marching column, rifles slung over their shoulders. Finally, the carts pulled by sturdy mules and guarded by more soldiers. El Empecinado waited patiently, letting the column advance fully into the gorge. He needed them trapped with no possibility of retreat or rapid advance. The signal was a single shot from the commander's position. Immediately, 50 Spanish muskets roared from the heights. The defile filled with smoke and echoes. The French, surprised, tried to organize themselves as the bullets whistled down from above. Several dragoons fell from their mounts. The startled horses whinnied and kicked, adding to the chaos. However, French discipline was impressive. The sergeants began shouting orders, organizing their men into defensive formations. Get down. El Empecinado's order was clear even amidst the din. The Spanish guerrillas emerged from their elevated positions, descending the rocky slopes with bayonets fixed. It was the moment of truth. All of Rodrigo's work, all the theories about balance and center of gravity, all the controversy surrounding shortening bayonets, everything would be put to the test in the next few minutes of brutal combat. Rodrigo felt his feet touch level ground and charged forward alongside his comrades. The French, recovering from their initial surprise, formed bayonet lines to meet the Spanish attack. The clash was inevitable. Steel against steel, will against will. The first French soldier Rodrigo faced was a scarred veteran with a cold gaze and efficient movements. The Frenchman thrust, expecting the clumsy, slow response he had experienced in previous encounters with the Spanish guerrillas. But Rodrigo's response was anything but clumsy. The shortened bayonet moved with surprising speed, deflecting the French attack with an economical motion. Rodrigo felt the weapon's perfect balance in his hands, its center of gravity exactly where his calculations had predicted. He counterattacked immediately, 2 quick taps that forced the Frenchman to retreat. The veteran enemy showed surprise in his eyes. This was not what he had expected from a Spanish guerrilla fighter. Manuel, fighting at the distance of 2 meters, experienced the same revelation. His opponent attempted to use the superior reach of the French bayonet, but Manuel discovered he could easily dodge it and penetrate the enemy guard, where the shortened bayonet was devastatingly effective. The French soldier tried to retreat to regain the optimal distance, but Manuel pressed him relentlessly, giving him no room to recover.
Antonio faced 2 Frenchmen simultaneously, a situation that would normally have been fatal. But the speed of his modified weapon allowed him to quickly switch targets, keeping both enemies at bay. He feinted toward the first and then fluidly turned to attack the second, all in a single seamless movement that would have been impossible with a standard bayonet. The French, bewildered by the unexpected agility of their Spanish opponent, were unable to coordinate their attack. The fighting in the defile reached a climax when Diego, the veteran sergeant, faced the French officer commanding the column. He was an infantry captain, recognizable by his distinctive uniform and his small officer's sword. The Frenchman had drawn his sword, confident in his superior training with edged weapons. Diego held his musket with Rodrigo's modified bayonet, aware that all eyes on both sides were momentarily focused on this impromptu duel. The French captain attacked first, tracing elegant arcs with his sword in the air. He was a skilled swordsman, his movements fluid and precise.
Diego blocked the first attack with the barrel of his musket, and then the second. The Frenchman's sword constantly sought an opening in the Spanish defense. But then Diego changed tactics. Instead of trying to match the sword's rhythm, he used his shortened bayonet to execute swift, direct thrusts, forcing the Frenchman to interrupt his elegant attacks to defend himself. The advantage of superior balance became clear. Diego could shift from defense to attack with a speed the French captain hadn't anticipated. Every time the officer attempted a sweeping movement with his sword, Diego countered with a direct thrust that landed first. The Frenchman retreated one step, then another, and his initial confidence crumbled before the unexpected effectiveness of his guerrilla opponent. Finally, Diego found his opening, a swift thrust that slipped past the captain's guard and grazed his chest. In actual combat, it would have been a fatal wound. The French captain lowered his sword, acknowledging his defeat. Around him, his soldiers were experiencing the same unpleasant surprise. The Spanish guerrillas, historically outmatched in hand-to-hand combat, were now fighting with a ferocity and effectiveness that matched and even surpassed the veteran French. The shortened bayonets fulfilled all of Rodrigo's promises: greater speed, better balance, and more powerful thrust thanks to improved energy transfer. The battle turned decisively in favor of the Spanish. The French, facing an enemy far more capable in hand-to-hand combat than expected, began to lose cohesion. Some tried to retreat to the wagons, others sought refuge among the rocks. The surviving dragoons, with no room to maneuver effectively with their horses in the narrow defile, dismounted to fight on foot. But this only put them at a greater disadvantage against the guerrillas, who knew the terrain perfectly. At this point in the battle, and before explaining the final consequences of this operation, let's build a community. Where are you from? Spain, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, or somewhere else? Share your thoughts on this historic battle. If you enjoy this content, please support us with a subscription. Let's continue with the dramatic aftermath. 20 minutes after the assault from the heights began, the battle was over. 37 French soldiers lay dead or seriously wounded in the defile. Another 23 had surrendered when it became clear that further fighting was suicidal. The rest had managed to escape, scattering into the mountains, though without the supply wagons they were meant to protect. Spanish casualties were remarkably low: 4 dead and 9 wounded, considerably lower than in previous ambushes. El Empecinado walked among the captured wagons, inspecting the loot. There was enough ammunition to keep 3 guerrilla units operating for months: quality French gunpowder, preserves, and modifiable uniforms, and most valuable of all, quality French rifles that could replace some of the old Spanish muskets. But the true treasure of that victory wasn't material. Rodrigo cleaned his modified bayonet, watching the French blood mingle with the water of a nearby stream. Manuel approached, his own shortened bayonet still in hand. "It worked," he said simply, a mixture of astonishment and relief in his voice. "It really worked. We were faster than them, more agile. For the first time I felt we had the upper hand in close combat." Antonio joined them, sporting a superficial wound on his left arm but smiling broadly. "I took on 2 at once and survived. With the old bayonet, I'd be dead." Diego approached the group, leading the captured French captain. The enemy officer regarded Rodrigo with professional curiosity. "Who modified your bayonets?" he asked in Spanish with a heavy accent. Rodrigo looked up, surprised by the question. "Yes," he replied cautiously. The captain nodded slowly. "They're superior to our standard design in close combat. The balance is perfect. We lost this battle partly because of the innovation." The confession of a veteran French officer carried weight. El Empecinado, who had overheard the exchange, placed a hand on Rodrigo's shoulder.
You have given Spain a new weapon, blacksmith, more valuable than any cannon or rifle, because it has restored our men's confidence in hand-to-hand combat. The guerrilla commander was already thinking strategically. He would send messengers to other guerrilla units to share Rodrigo's discovery. He would write to General Castaños, suggesting the official adoption of this modification. The French prisoners were disarmed and released, with a message for their commanders. The Spanish guerrillas would no longer be easy prey in hand-to-hand combat. The supply wagons were dismantled, and their contents distributed among the allied guerrillas in the region. The dead from both sides were buried with full military honors, and El Empecinado insisted that, even in war, respect for the fallen was essential. That night, in the Spanish camp, the mood was noticeably different. The men cleaned and sharpened their modified bayonets with reverent care, as if they were sacred relics. They recounted stories of their duels over and over, each tale emphasizing the difference the improved weapons had made. Esteban, the initial skeptic, publicly apologized to Rodrigo for his earlier doubts. The Spanish blacksmith, however, remained humble. He knew he had solved a technical problem, nothing more. The men who fought and died that day were the true heroes. But as he observed his comrades, he saw something no mathematical analysis could capture: a renewed confidence, heightened morale, the conviction that they could face the French on equal terms. And that conviction, more than any weapon modification, would ultimately determine the outcome of the resistance war Spanish. The weeks following the battle in the Arenas ravine witnessed a remarkable transformation in Spanish guerrilla tactics throughout the mountainous region. True to his word, El Empecinado sent messengers to all allied guerrilla groups within a 100-kilometer radius. The messages meticulously described Rodrigo's modifications, precise measurements, cutting angles, and retempering procedures. They also included testimonials from soldiers who had fought at Arenas, whose personal experiences corroborated the technical recommendations. The initial response was mixed. Some guerrilla commanders embraced the innovation immediately, sending their own blacksmiths or armorers to visit El Empecinado's camp to learn directly from Rodrigo. Others remained skeptical, reluctant to modify standard military equipment without official orders from their superiors. But every time a unit with modified bayonets engaged the French, the results spoke for themselves. Victories piled up, and Spanish casualties dropped dramatically in close combat. General Francisco Javier Castaños, supreme commander of the Spanish forces in the region, received El Empecinado's report with great interest. He was a traditionally trained officer, but also a pragmatist who recognized the value of innovation when the results were evident. He ordered an official demonstration, a regular Spanish unit with standard bayonets against a guerrilla unit with modified bayonets, all under the supervision of his most experienced staff officers. The demonstration took place in a field near Talavera in May 1809. Rodrigo was personally summoned to oversee the test and explain his modifications to the regular officers. The blacksmith, uncomfortable with the attention of so many high-ranking men, explained his calculations with the simple clarity of someone who has mastered his craft. He spoke of centers of gravity, energy transfer, muscle fatigue, and tactical advantages. The officers, initially condescending toward the self-taught guerrilla fighter, began to nod in agreement as they recognized the soundness of his reasoning. The simulated combat exercises produced unequivocal results. Soldiers with modified bayonets won 73% of individual engagements. In group engagements, the advantage was even greater. Soldiers with modified weapons were able to maintain the pace of combat for significantly longer periods of time without suffering debilitating fatigue. General Castaños made a historic decision. He would officially recommend the adoption of shortened bayonets for all Spanish infantry units operating in mountainous terrain. However, the modification never became the official standard for the entire Spanish army. Military bureaucracy, logistical limitations, and institutional resistance prevented its universal adoption. Nevertheless, for guerrilla forces, mountain units, and soldiers who fought daily in hand-to-hand combat against French veterans, Rodrigo's bayonets became standard equipment. It's estimated that by the end of 1809, more than 2,000 Spanish guerrillas carried bayonets modified according to the design of the blacksmith from Avila. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. The Spanish soldiers, who had internalized a feeling of inferiority in hand-to-hand combat against the French, regained their confidence. This renewed confidence manifested itself in more aggressive tactics, a greater willingness to close the distance with the enemy, and a ferocity in combat that repeatedly surprised the French commanders. French military reports of the time began to mention with increasing frequency the unexpected effectiveness of the Spanish guerrillas in close-quarters engagements. Rodrigo himself continued serving under El Empecinado until the end of the Peninsular War.
He survived dozens of battles, always carrying the first modified bayonet he had created with his own hands. Manuel and Antonio also survived the war, and both tell stories about the blacksmith who changed the course of battle with a simple but brilliant idea. Diego, the veteran sergeant, died in 1812 defending a bridge near Salamanca, but his last words were reportedly of gratitude to Rodrigo for giving him a fair chance in the fight. After the war, with the final expulsion of Napoleon's forces from Spain in 1814, Rodrigo returned to his hometown of Avila. He reopened his forge, crafting agricultural tools and horseshoes instead of modifying weapons of war. He never sought official recognition for his innovation, content to know that he had saved Spanish lives. But the veterans who had served with him told their stories, and the legend of the blacksmith who had improved the Spanish bayonet spread through generations of soldiers.
Modern military historians recognize Rodrigo's modification as an early example of tactical innovation born of necessity in guerrilla warfare. The principle he discovered, that balance and speed can overcome reach in close combat under specific conditions, has been repeatedly validated in subsequent military contexts. The design of modern edged weapons for special forces and close-quarters combat units incorporates many of the same principles that Rodrigo intuitively calculated in a cave in the Sierra de Gredos Mountains in 1809. Rodrigo's modified bayonet represents more than just a technical improvement. It symbolizes the human capacity for innovation under pressure, the importance of questioning established assumptions, and the value of listening to ideas from unconventional sources. A blacksmith with no formal military training identified and solved a problem that had eluded generations of professional officers simply by applying basic principles of physics and a practical understanding of his craft. Spanish military museums still preserve some examples of shortened bayonets from the War of Independence. Each one represents not only an object of steel and iron, but also a testament to how individual ingenuity can alter the course of conflicts, how innovation can arise from the most unexpected places, and how sometimes the solution to complex problems lies in a simple idea executed with precision. The story of Rodrigo and his modified bayonet remains as a reminder that in war, as in life, the best innovations often come from those closest to the real problem, not from those farther away in military or academic ivory towers.